Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Apostate of Mind, where we take a critical and scholarly approach to religion, its origin, and its sacred writings. I'm Mark Peralta, and today we're starting a series of episodes where we're going to answer the following question: did Jesus really fulfill Messianic Jewish prophecy? And for that, I've brought in Rabbi Moshe Shulman, who's an expert not only on this history, the Jewish text, but also the Hebrew language. It's going to be an awesome episode, so please stick around till the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe the video and share it with your friends. If you're looking for reasons why, Jewish people still continue to reject Christianity as like the fulfillment of their sacred writings, this is the episode for you. So let's begin. It's good to have you, Rabbi Moshe Shulman. How are you?
Hi, how are you doing? Everything's okay.
Excellent. So I know that you've got an intro for us. So
yeah, what I did is essentially this, just for the people who know what we're working off of here. You sent me a list of 41 supposed prophecies that Jesus fulfills or whatever. Mm-hmm. They're standard stuff. It's nothing, unusual. And so what I said, I would go through each and every one of them and discuss each one, which, about it. And then we can analyze, is it really a fulfilled prophecy or whatever. So what I wanted to do is, before just going, usually in these kinds of things, you shoot off a prophecy and somebody goes and attacks little points. What I want to do is I want to go into it the way a person who's being serious about it would do things. Religion is a very important thing, and it's a very serious matter for some people. So if you're going to be doing things which will be criticizing somebody, you have to have a serious approach to it, because, you're influencing people in their lives. You can actually be changing people's lives. So it's very important to understand that. So what I wanted to do is, before we go into the verses that you have there, a number of classical verses are used, I wanted to discuss a little bit about, well, how do we know what a verse means? Nobody ever talks, says, the Bible says this, the Bible says, but how do you know, what are your guidelines? What are your rules? So first, what I'll say is like this. The text that I'm using mostly, I'm going to use the Hebrew. But the English that I might quote from, or I'll mostly be quoting for, is the 1917 version of the JPS. I like that a little bit better. It's got its faults and it's got its advantages. So if I see something there that's not exactly right, I'll just do something else. Now, our whole discussion here is really about what verses mean. And the question is, what do you mean, what does a verse mean? Nobody ever says, how do we do it? So among scholars, they talk about two ways of looking at verses or passages. One they refer to as exegesis, and the other is called eisegesis. Now, it's very important when we're dealing with a text, especially when you're dealing with people who don't agree with you, that we only do what's called exegesis. So let me explain the difference between the two, give some examples, and then you'll understand where we're coming through here. Exegesis it really means you're saying, what does the verse actually mean? What does a text actually mean? Whether you're talking about a passage or even a verse. Most people don't really, when I speak to Christians, they sort of forget sometimes that most of the Tanakh that I call the Old Testament is actually prose. Okay? There's very few books at all, Proverbs maybe, which is, you can look at one verse at a time without having it doesn't have a context. Although even the Proverbs, it's like a list of, it's like a topic, but you can look at one verse. You could actually take that one verse out, and the context is helpful, but it's not 100% this. The rest of it is prose. The Book of Kings, for example, is just prose. The Torah itself, the first 5 books, is prose. So the prophecies and prophets are also basically prose in that sense. It's that. So it's very important when you're looking at it. You want to deal with what's called exegesis. Exegesis means you're trying to find, what does a text mean? Now, except when you have questions about the meaning of words themselves, or it might have obscure references. Basically, when you're doing exegesis, you're basically reading what the text says. The text usually is very self-explanatory. We're going to actually see some prophecies that are universally accepted as being messianic. There's a couple that hopefully we'll get to today, because they have to do with one of the questions on one of the supposed prophecies on the list, in which we'll actually see how Messianic prophecies are really pretty much self-explanatory, just from reading it. And that's important. That's what exegesis is usually. Usually exegesis is self-explanatory. Now, when I say self-explanatory, for example, if you know the Hebrew language and you read the Hebrew text, it's very self-explanatory. But if you're speaking English and trying to understand the Hebrew text, the words have certain nuances in Hebrew that don't have in other languages. Anybody who's multilingual pretty much is familiar with such things. Mm-hmm. So, if you speak English in another language, depending on how close it is one to another, you realize there's nuances in languages of it. So exegesis is basically trying to get at what does something mean. Sometimes it has to do with the wording that's there, but it's essentially that's what does it mean. Now, also in the same sense, we have to understand when it comes to prophecy, what does a prophecy mean? In the Tanakh itself, now I use the Tanakh for the Old Testament for those people who are Christians. It's just more comfortable because I don't believe the New Testament is scripture or the word of God anyways. So to me, there's nothing old about it. It's the only one. So I refer the Hebrew word Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, which is the first 5 books, Nevi'im, the prophets, which involves the prophets and historical books before that, and the Kesuvim, the writings, which Psalms and Proverbs and Job and a few other things there. This is a traditional way of doing it going back 2,000 years or so. Prophecies in the Tanakh we see a certain way, and this is why we have to understand exegesis. So I want to give a perfect example of it, but when we see prophecy in the Tanakh, we see prophecy as being literally fulfilled according to what the text says. So let me give you one of my favorite examples. In the first book of Kings, chapter 13, the historical background is basically the northern kingdom split from the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom started worshiping idols. Jeroboam, what they say in English, Yeroboam ben Nevat, made a altar in the city of Bethel, which is outside Jerusalem, but it was in the northern kingdom. That part, Samaria, was outside, and he made an altar, and he worshipped that altar. He rejected the place where God said to worship in Jerusalem. Okay, that's the background on the kingdom. But what happens is a prophet gets sent to him, and he goes to Bethel, and he speaks to Jeroboam himself, and he says this. This is chapter 13 in the first book of Kings, and it's verse 2. I'm reading from the JPS version. I don't think that the KJV or any others have much of it's different. So the prophet is saying to Jeroboam himself, and he cried against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, meaning the idolatrous altar of heaven. Thus saith the Lord, behold, a son shall be born unto the house of David. Josiah by name, Yeshayui is a Hebrew name, Yeshayui is his name. And upon thee shall be he sacrifice the priests of the high places that offer upon thee, and men's bones shall they burn upon thee. Now, the reason for burning the bones is that since a dead body, things that become a dead body become ritually impure, burning the bones on it is really a way of really disgracing it and really teaching it back. That's what it is. So we see here a very specific prophecy of what's going to happen. God sends somebody, says specifically exactly what's going to happen. That he's going to kill the priests of it, and he's going to burn bones on it. And it even says specificity of saying who exactly is going to be. Yeshayui is his name in Hebrew, but Josiah is what is in English. This is the person who's going to do it. Now, when we look later on, we actually see this fulfilled in the second book of Kings, the 23rd chapter. In the 15th verse, we read, moreover, the altar that was at Bethel, this altar we're talking about, in the high place which Jeroboam ben Nevat, who made Israel to sin, had made, talking about this place again, the prophet came in, even that altar in the high place he broke down, and he burned the high place and stamped it small to powder and burned the Asherah. Asherah is a type of worshiping of trees. Okay, and Josiah, Yeshayui, the name mentioned there, turned himself. He spied the sepulchres that were there in the mount, and he sent and he took the bones out of sepulchres and burned them upon the altar and defiled it, according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these things. Okay, so we see here that when there's a prophecy within the Tanakh, when we see fulfillment within the Tanakh, it's explicitly exactly what it is. Nothing's left out. Okay? So we have other things like, for example, Abraham was told his children will be in Egypt, in exile, in a foreign land, and Hashem and God will take them out. Okay, so we see that in the book of Exodus. We see the whole story of the Exodus. Exodus is actually fulfillment of a prophecy and a promise that Hashem said. Okay, same thing here. We understand that within the Tanakh itself, prophecies are given that are to be fulfilled within that period of time there are explicitly fulfilled exactly as it says. Okay?
I see.
And that's a very important thing to understand, because that's the principle of exegesis. Okay? When a prophecy is said, we understand the exegesis. When the prophet says, this is what's going to happen, in the Tanakh, we're quite clear that we have to understand exactly. The prophet said, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. Exactly. It's very important.
Okay.
Now, there's another thing called eisegesis. Now, eisegesis is not necessarily false. Okay? Eisegesis means that you're using a verse, much like a vehicle, to, bring out a concept of thing that you believe to be true, or as a truism. And you're using the verse sort of as a vehicle. I'm going to give you an example 1 minute. But it's like you hear sermons, whether rabbis giving a sermon, and they'll use a verse, and they'll use that verse to sort of explain a certain concept that's pretty well known, like you're supposed to be good to people, you're supposed to give charity. And the verse there may not even have to do with it, but it sounds like it could fit for that. Okay, It's called eisegesis. Not same with the verses. My favorite one to give an example of that is there's a rabbinic teaching on the verse in Isaiah 53:10. And the verse says, he will see seed and live a long time. Okay? We'll see seed and live, that's 53:10. See seed and live a long time. So it's brought by the rabbis, something that's a truism. Anybody who's been sick knows. When a person's sick, we're talking usually about men, you lose all physical, that you don't have a desire to eat, you don't have a desire for sexual relations. You lose all your desires when you get sick. Or, have a fever. When you get sick, that's not.
Mm-hmm.
But once a male begins to have his normal sexual desires start to come back, that's a sign he's over the sickness. So that's what the rabbis say. You'll see seed, meaning that you'll have an emission. Your desire, sex will come back. That means you're going to live a long time. Isaiah wasn't talking about that. But it's a nice verse that brings out a point that, it's true. It's a medical information. When a person starts getting his desires back, it's a sign that they're healing from a sickness that they had. That's eisegesis. You can take it or leave it. Okay? It's saying something that's true, but, Isaiah clearly did not have that in mind when he said it, and God didn't have it in mind specifically when he said it, okay? But it's a truism, okay? That's eisegesis. Not saying that it's not something that could be useful, but again, if it wasn't true to begin with, putting on the verse doesn't make it true. You're using the verse because you're trying to say into the verse something that's a truism.
I see.
It's very important. Okay.
So just to kind of recap, I'm hearing you that there are two main ways of looking at a text. One would be the one where you're seeking the meaning of what the text it has or is, right, and that is through exegesis.
It's called exegesis, yes.
Exegesis, yeah. But then there's another way of looking at scripture, not necessarily trying to get into the bottom of the meaning of the text, but some application. There's some benefit to referencing a passage, not necessarily trying to get to the meaning of it, but just sort of like working with it.
Using it as like a vehicle to bring out an idea and showing that, giving it a little spiritual part for the verse. But it's not what the verse is really talking about. When we do, we understand. That's extremely common in many works that you see out there in commentaries. I mean, goes back to the oldest thing that I know of is Philo's commentary. And Philo that's just all Philo is. He's not explaining, he's just, it's all eisegesis. It's interesting, but it's all eisegesis. And it's important to know when we're talking about prophecy, we're talking about what did God intend, okay? And we have to understand, did God intend what we're explaining the verse to mean or not? Are we doing eisegesis or exegesis? It's very important, okay? And when we look at these prophecies, that's always something you should keep in mind. Are they saying this because they already believe the concept and just trying to find a verse that supports it? Or is it the verse actually that's saying this and they're just believing because the verse says it? That's an important point, okay, to keep in the back of your mind. And so when we talk about it, it's important to know these differences. Now, I could go through lots of rabbinic literature. There's sometimes rabbis teaching out verses, and there's actually another place where it actually teaches the same thing, but they're using this verse instead of the actual verse, which is more explicit about. It's just a type of technique, okay? It only becomes important when we're speaking to people who don't believe like us and say, okay, well, where do you get that from? And then you have to explain where it's really coming from, and then just why they're using verse. But in the discussion we're having now about prophecies, when you're telling somebody that the Tanakh, the Old Testament says, prophesies X, Y, Z is going to happen, then that better be based on exegesis, okay? That would be based on what it says, not you're reading it in because you already believe, for example, the New Testament, or you believe the Book of Mormon, or you believe the Quran, and then you're looking at the Old Testament to prove what you're doing, and it has nothing to do with what the text says. Okay, that's not what you want to do. Mm-hmm. You certainly don't want to live your life based on things that are not based on what the text says. If you value the text, you do not want to live on something that's not based on what the text says. Now, we find actually, typically, when it comes to the Tanakh, not to the New Testament, by the way, New Testament, they don't follow this rule. But when it comes to the Tanakh, the Old Testament, invariably, almost all the interpretations you will see are actually eisegesis. They're not exegesis on the text. So there's various types of things that you have. I mean, everybody here is familiar with the idea of reading Jesus into the text. Mm-hmm. The verse in the New Testament says that the Messiah is all over the Old Testament. So they actually try to find verses and read Jesus into it, having no concern whatsoever. What is it actually talking about? We're going to see a bunch of these. That's obviously the massive thing. We're going to see a bunch of those there. Okay, so that's the important thing. Is reading Jesus into a text isn't what it is. You read the text and say, oh, did Jesus do that? That's another thing. There's another type of thing that's used, and they refer to prophetic types. In the Tanakh, nobody ever heard of that. Mm-hmm. It's basically an ad hoc thing where the New Testament has something, and they're saying, well, this person's a type. Abraham is a type of this. This is a type of that. We don't see that. People are people. Mm-hmm. I believe that this comes about because of a very significant difference between the New Testament with Christians and the Tanakh with Jews. Okay? A Jew who reads the Tanakh, I think I might have said it last time, I'm a Levite. That means I trace my ancestry all the way back to the son of Jacob, Levi. Okay? My mother's mother's father was a Kohen, a priest. So he traced his paternal line directly back to Moshe's brother, Aharon. Okay? When a Jew reads a text, we are reading something that we relate to directly. These are not, just things. So, for example, Abraham. Whenever I ask a Christian what I think about Abraham, they say a man of faith, and there's all kinds of things like that. Mm-hmm. And when I think of Abraham, that's grandpa. Okay, maybe a lot of generations back, but because there's a personal thing about it. Okay, we're I once told somebody, they refer to the Jews as the people of the book, but really the Tanakh is the book of the people. The Tanakh, most of it is really about the Jewish people. From the Torah all the way through the prophets, all about the Jewish people and their relationship with God. That's what it's about. Mm-hmm. So we look at it a different way. That's why prophetic types doesn't make sense to us, because these are real people. Whereas the New Testament, there's only one person in the New Testament who we know that some people are descendants of them that are alive today. Everybody else in the New Testament, Paul, nobody knows. Paul, Peter, we don't know if they're descendants or anybody. We don't know of anybody. The only one who we know is Gamliel. Gamliel in the New Testament book of Acts, he has descendants today.
Interesting.
One of his descendants was a rabbi in the Talmud called Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. And the famous Rabbi Rashi was the 33rd generation from him. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of people who are descended from Rashi today. Okay? Maybe not direct male line, but certainly directed to, descended. So, but the New Testament, you don't have it. Nobody, no. You speak to a Christian on the street, they have no. It's just like a name in a book. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to degrade the respect that they have, but I'm trying to say that it's just not a name of a book. It's like a novel. It's not it doesn't have reality. Where when I read the story of Abraham, that's my ancestors. Right now we're reading the parts of the Torah that have to deal with, the exodus from Egypt and things that happen. When I read that, I'm reading about things that were directly with my relatives. I have a direct relationship. And so we look at it differently. So when we look at the idea of a prophetic types doesn't mean anything because these are real people. Abraham was real people. He ate, he slept, he had a wife, he had children with this wife. There was over 2 wives actually. And this is real people, okay? And when a Jew looks at the Tanakh, it's whereas it was Christian something. So that they come up with this prophetic types because, it's like a literary type of thing. It's like foreshadowing you see in books, foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
I think it's more of it's a kind of a Hellenistic influence on the culture, this tupas. And I wanted to ask you about have you heard of this concept of double fulfillment? That's something that I hear.
Yeah, double fulfillment is awesome. We don't know of any. There's no double fulfillments in the Tanakh. I gave you one verse because that's the best one to show because it's really as explicit as it can get. There's no double fulfillments. When God said to Abraham that your descendants are going to be in exile, and I think there's no double fulfillment to that. Nobody's waiting for it to happen. The double fulfillment of that. That was a problem.
True.
Okay. The Tanakh knows of such thing. Double fulfillment is another thing like types, which is brought in order. I consider ad hoc, but it's been used so many years. It's very hard to say ad hoc now, But it's something that was brought in because of a recognition that the text doesn't support it. So I have to change the meaning of what a prophecy is. But double prophecies aren't necessary. I think we'll bring this up again when we talk about 7:14 because I know that's what it sometimes comes up. We can talk about it there. To somebody who is a Jew who learns who learns the Bible, spends time learning as I've had done. Most Jews are involved in basically what you have to do. I mean, if you've actually read the Torah, God, as far as the Jewish people is concerned, is very important. What you do, how you act, okay, and the other things are important. I mean, most of the Tanakh is history stuff. It's not it's not telling what to do. It's history stuff. So people read it. The next issue, I think, again, another part of eisegesis, and this really, it's not necessarily eisegesis, but it's a technique that I see a lot of times for missionaries, is that they will give multiple prophecies, supposedly, and they think by putting together 5 or 6 things that actually proves a point, while each one separately doesn't seem to do it. The first 4 that we talk about, we'll discuss that issue, okay? Because that's very relevant to understanding what's going on there. But, again, this is, we see, and we're going to see as we come on, because sometimes these prophecies, the prophecies that they're being actually touch on real prophecies that are significant, but we see these things that, that's not the way it is. Specificity and, the of it and the exactness in fulfillment is something that's there. There's no place for that. And if things are said multiple times, which sometimes happens, it's not because you have to bring them together. It's because they're basically saying the same thing. And we're going to see this actually. There's a couple of good examples of that. So the example that I was talking about where they do multiple is we have these 4 prophecies, 5 actually, where the Messiah is supposed to be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and David. Okay? Now, why they leave out Isaiah 11 with Jesse, I don't know. But I don't know. Jesse's maybe not as well known as David is. I don't know. But the point of the matter is why do you have to say all that? Once you said he's supposed to be David, which we're going to see later is very specifically said, why, if he's descended from David, we already know he's a descendant from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah. What are you doing all that? So we're going to discuss it even whether they're prophecies, but putting all that together doesn't make it more. I mean, I've seen people say, well, mathematically, the odds of it. Well, if you got 5 things and one of them includes all the other ones, those other ones you just throw out and you just do with the one. You don't have 5 things. You don't have one thing. In fact, mathematically, the odds don't increase if you put things there. But it's a way of giving the impression that there's more there than there is. Okay.
And one other principle that I heard, now this was from a Bible exposition prof in seminary, that I heard him talk about within that same conversation about double fulfillment. he said something like that God has a tendency of doing what he's done in the past and then doing it again, but only greater. And I think that the examples that he gave were related to the different covenants. And so you know how there's like the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and then there's like the renewing of these covenants between Yahweh and his people through different of the patriarchs. And so they're looking at that thinking, well, you see, God is renewing it and he's making it better. And so they're sort of looking at that as a tendency that eventually leads to, the Jesus message later on. What do you think about that?
Well, I've heard these multiple covenant theories, but that's not what the text is saying.
Is that even a thing? Like, I feel like they're just framing it in a way.
I mean, for example, after the event in Sinai, nobody talks about the covenant. Covenant is like an agreement that's made, okay, between Abraham. Okay, Abraham makes an agreement, and because of that merit, it goes. I mean, that's not building. That's Abraham made a covenant, and his covenant. There was a covenant made on Sinai. It's not going to change. The covenant given to Abraham didn't change, and as far as I can tell, Christianity, rather than expanding on the Sinai covenant, actually is restricting it. They don't say that everybody has to keep the Torah like Jews do. The exact opposite. The Book of Acts is quite clear about that. That's not the case. The non-Jews don't have to keep the Torah. So I don't see how that would even fit. I mean, factually, even according to his idea, but biblically, we don't see that. We don't see anybody saying that. When the Torah was given on Sinai, nobody said, well, we're adding to what Abraham said. When it's talked about Abraham, when it talks about Isaac and Jacob, what they have, it's always talked in the context that this is a continuation of what was given to Abraham. It's not a new covenant. It's just a continuation of the covenant that was given to Abraham. I think one of these verses we'll see that is. And when we talk about, many times it talks about giving the land, it's talked about how the land of Israel is given because of, it was a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, that was a promise made to them because they followed after God. So it's like, it's not, none of them, they neither negated nor anything like that. The covenant Sinai didn't negate or add to it. The covenant Sinai was something special. Okay, when they said the Exodus.
So it's not a renewal in the sense like it's a new system now. The way they make it sound is like every time there's a renewing of a covenant, it's a new administration. Like God just changed modes. And so within each covenant, there's like a set of...
Let me give a specific example. Abraham was told that part of the agreement of the covenant was that he should circumcise himself. That was not negated. We know that, in fact, in the Torah itself, it talks about circumcising on the 8th day. So it's not considered, it doesn't say I'm adding to it or whatever. It's just wasn't taken away. That was part of the thing that for the ancestors, for the descendants of Abraham, they were supposed to do that. Okay. So again, whenever you hear something like that, you have to say, is this person saying it because he's trying to justify his belief, or is he saying it because anybody reading the text would think that that's the case? Nobody reading the text, going from Genesis to Exodus, where the Torah is given, would ever think that. Never.
Right. I mean, you have to read that into it because it's not set there.
Yeah, and all the thousands of years of commentators, Jewish commentators, I never saw that anywhere. That even ideas. It just seems like you're trying to justify why you believe something by changing what's really going on.
Right.
So let's talk a little specifically now about general rules of texts and prophecy in general. Try and go and do this. So the first thing, the last thing, and the middle thing is what's called context.
Okay.
Every verse has a context, okay, except for maybe Proverbs, which is things, and even there sometimes there is actually context. But essentially, every verse has a context, whether it's part of the Psalms, it always has a context in which is involved. And context can be very complex. It could be this historical context. Psalms, for example, you can't understand Psalms unless you know the history of David in the book of Samuel. If you don't know David's life in the book of Samuel, you have no idea about a lot of the things that's said in the book of Psalms, because it's very personal, very autobiographical. Okay? But context, it's context. Once you get away from the context, you're not going to understand it. So when you read a text, a verse, you read it in context. You read from the beginning, maybe a paragraph before, maybe the chapter before, how it works, where it fits in, where this verse fits in. Okay, then you know. So, for example, 7:14, which we'll get to, it's going to be a very long discussion. It says a young woman. KJV says a virgin. Doesn't really. In understanding the text, it wouldn't really make a difference that virgin or not. But whatever the woman was there, okay, she would conceive and give a son. Okay, that's taken out. But what's the context of that? Mm-hmm. What's going on around there? Why? Where's it coming from? Okay. Mm-hmm. Invariably, you find when verses are brought by missionaries, or just just Christians, just to consult your pastor, whatever, he's going to bring a verse and say something, but he's never telling you the context, what's going on. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the context is important for one thing. For two things. Number one, the context. Sometimes you can find out historically what's going on there. 7:14 is going to be very important, the historical context. Okay. And sometimes, if you don't read it in the context, you might not understand what the verse is talking about. Micah 5:2, which in the Hebrew is 5:1. If you don't read the whole thing of what's going on there, you don't understand what's going on. You don't know the context of what it is. So it's very important to read understand the context before you just look at one verse.
So it sounds like you're referring to like the literary context, like what comes before and after, where it fits within the narrative.
Literary context. Text, for example, I mentioned the book of Psalms. There are Psalms you cannot. For example, the verse that says the cornerstone that was rejected became the stone that was rejected became the cornerstone. Okay, you cannot understand that unless you understand the specific story that's in the book of Samuel. Mm-hmm. Okay, the book of Samuel tells a story where the prophet Samuel comes to Jesse, David's father, because he was told by God he's going to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be king. Okay, all the kids, all Jesse brings all his kids except David. He doesn't bring. There seems to be something about David that Jesse was ashamed of him. He brings all his sons. He sings Shmuel, another. The prophet looks at him and says, "No, not this one." Gets to the last one. You don't have any other more sons? So I got David. David was rejected. Shmuel sees David, immediately anoints him for king. Mm-hmm. That's what David's talking about there. But you would not know that if you did not know David's history.
Yeah.
That's why context is important. And, even knowing about these, just knowing these stories and knowing where these things fit together, it helps you to understand what's being talked about.
And I'm glad you defined that well for us, Rabbi, because one of the things that I do hear a lot from perhaps not so well-trained apologists, because they'll talk about, oh yeah, but you're not. Actually, what I get a lot often is they claim that I'm not considering the context. But then when I ask them, like, what do you mean by that? What context are you referring to? Right. Almost always what they have in mind is more of a theological context.
Right. Their context
this isn't that it. This isn't that.
Their context is the New Testament teaches something. Therefore, the Tanakh has to be the same thing. But, that may work for somebody who's a Christian, but if you're Jewish or somebody who actually, that's not the way it works. Tell me where this says here that it fits with yourself. Not that you say that and you're trying to impose it onto us. Mm-hmm. So remember, that's eisegesis, okay? We want to always try and exegete. And even when I speak to Christians, when I deal with the New Testament, which I don't like to do very much because it's not scripture anyways, but, with Christians, I have to deal with it sometimes. I always have read as many sources, I know Christian sources, to understand what is the context? What are they saying it really means in their own context? Not looking at it from the outside, but trying to understand the context. So I don't usually attack as many things in the New Testament as others do, because I understand, I understand sort of the context. So, okay, fine. Because to me, the New Testament is it's just like any other historical novel, maybe. No, it's not. Mm-hmm. So, but I understand when I do it that I want to do with them the same thing that I expect them to do with me. I want you to be respectful and understand the context of the Tanakh in itself, not trying to impose something. So I'm not going to impose anything other than the New Testament. Try and understand things. That, again, is what I try and do. Okay, so that's the first of the context. Now we talk about prophecy. When we read something, somebody says it's a prophecy. How do you know it's a prophecy? You say it's a prophecy? What do you mean it's a prophecy? When you've read the context, you know what a prophecy, but really, what is a prophecy? Well, we saw one before, which is a paradigm for what we're talking about. It said that there's going to be the man of God who was a prophet who came to Yervine, told him you should know that, you're a bad boy. And what's going to happen is sometime a descendant of King David's going to come here. He's going to destroy this and burn bones on top of it. That's a prophecy. That's. I don't think anybody looking to say no. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. No, that smells like a prophecy. It looks like a prophecy. Okay. So when you read a thing, you have to be careful. Is that a prophecy or is it not? Okay. Sometimes we have things in the Tanakh which just telling future events that's going to happen. Not to when God tells Abraham his descendants are going to be in exile for and enslaved for 400 years, for example. That's just telling what's going to happen in the future. It's not a prophecy in the sense of a prophecy. It's just saying, hey, listen, right now in the order of things, time, this is going to happen. Or, for example, Lot in Hebrew. He gets the angels come to him and tell him your city is going to be destroyed. It's not a prophecy. These guys are coming to do it. They're coming to do it. I wouldn't consider that's not really a prophecy. Prophecy is sometime in the future is that. Now, I don't want to get into what prophets are sent for, but we're going to deal with just the issue of prophecy here. Prophecy means you're saying something to happen in the future. Again, your paradigm is what I showed in the Book of Kings. That's your paradigm for what a prophecy is. Okay? When somebody says something, you have to, does that look like that? Mm-hmm. Now, whether it's been fulfilled or not is a different story. In that perspective, it was fulfilled within the Tanakh. But Messianic prophecies haven't been fulfilled. We agree also that there's prophecies for the Messiah, but they haven't been fulfilled. But they will be fulfilled according to what it was said there. So, the question is this really prophetic? Is this really prophecy or not? Or is it just somebody saying that God promised? Or is it just something that somebody thinks that the prophet really isn't?
So what you're saying is that in order for us to correctly determine whether or not something is prophetic, we expect there to be some clues within the text.
It has to be pretty. It has to be pretty. As we said, it has to be explicit. Okay, you have to say something who reads in the context, reads the whole. Let's say, not just one verse. Let's say the whole paragraph. Say is like 2 or 3 verses, 3 or 4 verses. If you read the whole thing and it looks and smells like a prophecy, it's talking about something's going to happen. Then okay, you can say that verse is prophetic. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's some prophecy involved in that verse. Okay, that you can say. But if it doesn't, a lot of things pulled from the Psalms is it's not prophetic. No, Psalm 2:12. It's not prophetic. We'll get to that. I know we'll get probably sometime, but it's not a prophecy. It may apply to the Messiah, it may not apply to the Messiah, but it's not prophetic. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, when it's a prophecy, is it a messianic prophecy? Meaning, is it something that only the Messiah could fulfill? Okay. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we're going to talk about the Messiah to be a descendant from King David. There's a whole bunch of people running around descendant from King David. Okay. They're not all the Messiah. Okay. There's a specific person, Messiah. This brings out really a point that we should talk about. There's a fundamental difference between the Tanakh and the New Testament as far as the Messiah is concerned. Mm-hmm. In the Tanakh, the emphasis of a period of time, we're going to see that, a period of time when certain happens, and a descendant of David who's going to be prince in that time. Mm-hmm. In the New Testament, there's a Messiah, and when it is, I don't know, it's going to be second coming, it's going to come, whatever. The time means nothing. The Tanakh is there. We're going to see some prophecies. I mean, hopefully, I'm going on a little bit longer than I thought it would be on this part of it. But we'll see some real prophecies and say, hey, we're talking about a period of time and this guy who lives in it. If you want, I'm not going to go through right now. Isaiah 11 is a perfect example. Okay? Everybody agrees it's messianic, but it's talking about a certain period of time. And this guy who's in that certain, who's a certain type of person in that period of time. Okay? That's what the Tanakh is. Okay, when we talk when a Jew is Messianic prophet, it's a period of time, and the guy who's living it, who's the prince in that time, is who the Messiah is.
Now, what about the absence or the presence of the term itself, the Mashiach?
That's totally irrelevant.
That's
totally
irrelevant.
Totally
Okay.
irrelevant.
So what you're saying is that there could be something that is...
In fact, Mark, in the Tanakh, the word Messiah is never used for the Messiah. Not once. In Daniel, there's an argument about that. And if we talk about Daniel, we can get about why that's wrong. But essentially, Messiah is never used. The first time we know historically when Messiah is used for Messiah, as we mean, okay, is basically in the mid-late Second Temple period time.
Okay.
Okay, before that, there were other things, the son of David, there's all kinds of, Isaiah, it talks about a shoot from Jesse. There's all kinds of names used of it, but the actual name Messiah isn't really used, because Messiah just means somebody who's anointed. And there were a lot of people. High priest was anointed, kings were anointed, prophets were anointed. Messiah just means somebody who's anointed. Okay,
and it's not necessarily about one guy, right? It could be multiple people.
Well, when the real Messianic age comes, and there will be Messiah, the temple will be built. So there will be a priest who's anointed priest. It's going to be high priest, and there's going to be the anointed king, who will call them Messiah. Over time, the word Messiah alone, without anything to it, basically meant the one who's going to be the king. Right? But for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's well known that they had multiple Messiahs. They had three.
Right.
Okay. They had a priest,
a teacher of righteousness,
a preacher, a priest, a prophet, and the king. Okay, it's explicit that we know that. And we know that there's rabbinic sources which talk about multiple people becoming Messiah also. But historically, Messiah, we refer really to the guy who's going to be the king. We don't. That's maybe an issue I could take up, some other time if you want to. But basically, our convention now is like, for example, we call people rabbis. Okay, rabbi is a term which has a historical context. In Sephardic lands, in Africa, they didn't call what we call rabbis. They called them chacham, wise man. Okay, it's just a title. It's just what we call people who do a certain function. Messiah is somebody who does a certain function. Okay, that's what it is. I mean, the biblical text uses names for different things that we use later on, but it's the concept is what's important. So again, that's Messiah is essentially, for what we use Messiah for now, isn't really in the Tanakh. Okay, so let me continue on with this. So we have to be clear, is this verse what we call talking about the Messiah? Doesn't use the name Messiah, but it talks about it. And we have some very clear ones. I mean, you mentioned in Jeremiah 23 and Jeremiah 33, we're going to come to those. Those are clearly Messianic. Nobody disagrees about that. Isaiah 11, nobody disagrees about that. Although, in not a single one do they use the word Messiah. But everybody knows about it, who it is. Because the Messiah is a term that we use for a person living in that period of time who becomes the king. That's the name that we call him. Store. Okay. The next thing is that let's say that this text is actually Messianic, and it actually mentions the Messiah. The question is, did Jesus actually do it?
Right.
Did he fulfill what it said in there? Now that's a yes or no question. Okay. Did he actually do it? And if he didn't do it, then he didn't do it. Saying that he's going to come later on a second time to do it just means to say, okay, he failed. That's just, I don't know of any prophecy in the Tanakh itself where we see it fulfilled that they had a first chance that they did do it, and the second chance they got it right.
Right.
I don't see anywhere it works like that. That's like, you strike out and you say, I'm going to hit a home run the next time. And you're bragging about how big a home run hitter you are because you're going to do it the next time. You didn't do it. Either you did or you didn't do it. That's all there is to it. And prophecy, again, your paradigm for prophecy is in the 1 Kings where it says what's going to happen. And when it gets done completely. Okay? There's no things, it didn't do that. It's going to be done later. No, it gets done. Okay? All this stuff that it could be happening the second time, it's like you said, dual fulfillment. All this stuff is because you realize something didn't work out. it didn't work out the way it's supposed to. There's a whole bunch of things that didn't happen, so it has to come a second time. Okay. So again,
that's what we refer to in English as a cop-out.
It's basically what happens when you see that somebody fails and you're trying to redefine it. We should talk about this sometime. It's called cognitive dissonance. It was a very, very famous book written in the 50s, When Prophecy Fails. I don't know if you've heard about that. It was a phenomenal book. It was not even written about Christians. It was written about a UFO cult. What actually happens when they say that a certain day something's going to happen and it doesn't happen, what do they do afterwards? It's phenomenal because it's so true, and because we've seen it happen. Many Jehovah's Witnesses had the same thing when they predicted things in the 1800s and it didn't work. So it's a very well-known thing that happens to people who get totally invested in it. Okay, that's maybe a discussion for another time, not right now.
Yeah,
so again,
I agree.
So again, that's what I'm trying to talk about here. Okay, first, we have to, when we start approaching these, and we're going to approach the first one now that you have there. When we approach these, we have to approach these with an understanding of when we're looking at a text, we have to the context, is it a prophecy, is it not a prophecy? We have to go, and also another thing, and again, and I try to do this with the New Testament also with the times when I do it, you have to have respect for the text and respect for the religious beliefs. Am I really being serious about it? Am I looking at it really that way? Or am I just, I don't really care. I'm just trying to push it in and make it, make it. And to me, that's very important. Okay. It changes sometimes how you're going to react to things, but it doesn't change as far as I'm concerned, any of the results. The New Testament doesn't become scripture because, I'm looking at it respectfully or looking at it. It's not scripture because it's just not scripture, And then we can discuss that sometime also. That might be an interesting discussion another time.
Yeah.
Why I don't believe it's scripture.
So is it prophetic? If it's prophetic, then is it a messianic prophecy?
Right.
And if it is, did Jesus in this case
actually
really
did
do it, fulfill it?
Or are we waiting for him to come back and do it? If we're waiting for him to come back and do it, it's like he just never came.
Right.
Okay? And again, all of this comes back from when you look at it with the approach of exegesis, understand the context, understand exactly what it's trying to say. Okay. And again, as far as I'm concerned, whether you're Christian or Jewish, if you don't do that, you're showing a certain degree, or if you're an atheist, for example, if you don't do it that way, you're not showing respect for the text and the people who believe in it. You're just not showing respect. You want to be respectful, okay? And if in the end you disagree, you still want to be, people will listen to you if you show that you're respectful. Okay? If you don't, then people won't listen to you. Okay, that's my whole introduction. It took a little bit longer than I thought it would be. So we'll try and do some of the things, and we could always come back a second time. I mean, that's...
And a very important introduction of that. So I thank you.
Yeah. Well, again, the reason why I say it is because many of the times when people are, I consider myself not a Catholic missionary, but a Jewish apologist. I'm trying to say, hey, listen, this is what God really taught the Jewish people. This is what it says. That's what I'm interested in. New Testament, it's not scripture. I know why I don't think it's scripture. We can talk about that. So I don't really, but this is, so that's my approach. So and it's very important. Where am I coming from? I'm coming from the way of saying, I have respect for the text. I have a respect for God and for the prophets who and they meant something that had a context. I'm not going to play games with it. Okay. There are places where there's going to be disagreements, and there's valid disagreements in certain language and certain. I'm not going to. No, that's not the point. The point is when you approach it with a certain attitude and respect for the text, you come out looking at things differently, and it's very important. And I think it also convinces people. Also, if you want to convince people, but that's but we're just talking about really the proper way. Okay, so you know what? Why don't you read me the first one that you had, and we'll start discussing it.
So, folks, we've got 41 prophecies, so-called Messianic Jewish. Jesus fulfilled prophecies. I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we're going to start with number 1. And I can't wait to see how this turns out.
Okay. Do you want to post it and read it? Oh, there you go. Okay.
So the first one is that the Messiah would come from the line of Abraham. And generally the texts that are Referenced here are Genesis 12, verse 7, and Genesis 22, verse 18.
Okay, that's good. Just by the way, I think we should, so you gave me 41, but if you have people listening have other favorite prophecies of theirs, because there's got to be 1,500 prophecies that they threw out, any favorite ones that they have with the verses as posted, feel free to send it to Mark. And, once we get finished, we could even go through some of those also, unless somebody sends one that's really important. Isaiah 53 we talked about last time, so we don't have to do that again, but I can explain certain things in Isaiah 53 that might be difficult. What you think is difficult to understand how it refers to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first one here is the Messiah would come from the line of Abraham. And there really is two verses, 12:7 and 22:17-18. So what I'd like to do is, let's take a look at them. Let me look at my private screen here. You can't see it, but let me do it.
And then for the viewers, what you're looking at on the screen is on the left side, we've got the Hebrew text, and on the right side is a translation. My preferred one here is a JPS, or the Jewish publication. So that's what you see there.
Right.
So anyway,
again, his JPS is a little bit different. He's using the later one. I like the 1917 more. I agree much more with some of the words he used translation. Don't agree with all, as I said before. Okay, so let's look 12:7 and then 22. Okay, so let's see what 12:7 says. Now, 12:7, of course, as you know, isn't part of a whole discussion here. It's chapter 12 starts off where God is speaking to Abraham, and he's telling him that he's supposed to leave his home, and that if he doesn't and follows it, he's going to be blessed for following God and doing what he says. And it talks about how he travels around with his family. When we get to verse 7, it said, and the Lord appeared to Avram. He hadn't changed it to Abraham yet, so his name was still Avram, and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. Now, what he's talking about is Abraham traveled, and he went to the land, which was the land of Canaan then, and God showed him the land. And then God tells him, listen, to your descendants, I will give this land. Okay? Now, I don't see anything prophetic in that.
mm-hmm.
As far as Messianic, I don't see anything prophetic. It's a promise that God gives, that I'm going to give this to you. And this, of course, was fulfilled in the book of the beginning of the book of Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
Where the land was given, that was fulfilled in the book of Joshua. That is the beginning of the fulfillment. In the book of Joshua was fulfilled. Okay, so it was given to the descendants of Abraham. Okay, I don't see any prophetic thing there at all. Okay, the next one is 22. Okay. Now, in there we have Abraham. This is the famous story where the binding of Isaac. Okay, and God tells Abraham as a test, it says that specifically he's testing him to see if he's going to listen to him. He's totally faithful to God. He brings his son there, and then God sends an angel to stop it. So after that, this is what it says there. I'm going to start in verse 16. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because thou hast done this thing, meaning he listened to him, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed. As the stars of the heavens, the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of its enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of earth be blessed, because thou hast hearkened unto my voice. Now, significantly, first of all, this is a promise. Semi-prophetic maybe, but what's important to understand is what is the blessing here that God is giving? God says specifically what the blessing is, that he will, Abraham, who had no, just his one child, he was willing to give his one child, Isaac was his one and only child from his actual wife. He had a child from a servant. He was willing to give his only child, which means his progeny would be totally wiped out. And because he was willing to do that, what was his reward? That God said he would multiply his descendants. It's not just this one Isaac, his one son. he's going to have a lot of sons. And he's going to have children, grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. He's going to have a lot of children. Invariably, what we're going to see, and this is a very important thing to understand, that invariably, God's promises, is always in this physical world. There are a few places which talks about judgment and reward in the next world, a handful at most. Primarily, it's what's going on in this world, and there's a very fundamental reason for that. And if you think about it 1 second, you have to understand it. A God who promises things pie in the sky and never has to deliver in this world, that's easy to do. They're a dime a dozen. Okay, they're a dime a dozen. But a God who promises that he's going to give you the land and does it, or a God who promises something this physically in this world that you can see, you're going to have descendants and descendants until even today, there are now millions of them, even though they've tried to kill us, murder us, they're constantly trying to murder us, we still are here. You know, that's the God that his word is fulfilled. You can see it. There's an important verse in the book of Deuteronomy. I don't remember what it is offhand, but I remember the Hebrew. I'll say the Hebrew, not translated. Anisturas Hashem Elkaini, Anigos Huni V'nani Adoilam. Anisturas, the hidden things, are for God. Those things that you see, world to come, what's coming, that's God's business. Okay, we see there's promises for that. That's God's business. Nigos, those things are revealed. What he's going to do, the Messianic age, the things that are going to happen, or what he promised the Jewish people that no matter what happened, the Jewish people would always be here. Okay, that's revealed for everybody to see. God promised the Jewish people always be here, and we're sitting here today. You know, Jesus promises you're going to have something with. I don't know. Do you know anybody who's come back to say that it's true? Nobody knows. That's a hidden thing. You're not going to. But God, who's a power, does things in this world. And we see that. That's why the promises that we see invariably are promises of this world. Because that's something I can say, oh, that was fulfilled. God promised Abraham his descendants would have the land. Book of Joshua tells it happened. We have archaeological evidence that Jewish people lived in the land. Okay? We know that. So they were exiled, they came in the second Timothy, they lived in the land. Okay? Because they've always lived in the land of Israel. Even when they were exiled, there were different places they made out in Jerusalem. But they lived. This is a promise given to Abraham. And it's openly because that's what it is. And that's exactly what's going on here. This is nothing messianic. This is God saying that, you know what? Abraham, your children are going to be important. They're going to multiply and they're going to be here. And we today, 2024, which 3,000 years later, are sitting here talking about, and you're talking to somebody who's descended from Abraham, one of those people. That's what the promise means here. It's not messianic at all. Science not even mentioned. What?
Not messianic at all. Yeah, I agree 100%. And that's one of those things that I see the New Testament authors do a lot is they'll because have you seen how the I think it's the Apostle Paul in Galatians?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about Galatians. I really actually wanted to talk about Galatians, but first I want to talk about what I believe is from God. Then we can talk about what Paul says, because I think Paul. There's a few things about Paul that's a problem. Okay, so this is the point. From this, we have to take 2 points. Number one, this is not messianic to begin with. And number two, we have to understand something which is very difficult for Christians to understand, that the promises invariably in the Tanakh are always about what God's going to do for the Jewish people in this world. Mm-hmm. There are a few places Isaiah talks about how those who are dead are going to rise, and Daniel talks about there's going to be people who are going to rise to be judged, stuff like that. There at the end of Isaiah talks about how the wicked people are going to be punished. Okay, there's some of that. Okay, but the most important thing from both sides is first what God's going to do for us, and second, of course, what we have to do for God. That's all the commandments we have to, all the things we have to, all these things. So everything, these things are all openly. Nothing's hidden. Nothing you have to, you don't have to have faith. Mm-hmm. You can trust in God that He's going to do it. Which we find by Abraham says that he trusted in God, and he considered righteous. And what he trusted in God because God had promised him something. And he trusted God that he's going to fulfill his promise. That's a different story. But the promises are physical promises that are going to happen in the world.
Tell us about the word that's often translated there as offspring. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Is it Zerah?
Zerah.
Zerah?
Let's go to Galatians now, because I did want to talk about that. Galatians 3:16. Let's read it. Now to Abraham and his seed were promises made. True, the promises made that the land would be given to his seed, and there would be a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. Okay, he said it says to multiply his seed. He doesn't say to the seeds, plural, as of many, but as one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. Well, first of all, can Jesus be said? Well, can Jesus be said to? Before we talk about there itself and that, but let's just let Jesus himself. Can Jesus be said to have fulfilled what God was saying to Abraham? That he was willing to give his only son, so he's going to reward him. That not just one son, he's going to have a multitude coming from him. From this one son's going to be a multiple. Right now, there's like 15, 20 million Jews, all coming back from Isaac. Mm-hmm. Here's that one son, all of them. And we can talk about Jewish history, how the slaughters and this and all kinds of stuff that happened. It's a miracle that there's any Jews, but they are. That's God's promise to Abraham. There will be his descendants. So does Jesus have that?
No, and in that context, Isaac is spared. He's not spared. He was sacrificed.
Well, so he didn't really show that. They tried to compare with the. Remember the binding. It says in the beginning. It says it starts it off in the beginning of verse 22, chapter 22. It says that God was testing Abraham. It was a test to see whether he would follow what God wanted him to do, no matter how hard it was. Okay? And reward, of course, is that. So the first thing we have there is, Jesus did not fulfill it. Okay? The promise was given to Abraham that his descendants would have the land and all that kinds of. Jesus had nothing to do with any of those kinds of promises were given to Abraham. No. That he would take, that the land would be given to his seed and he would have a lot of them. This has nothing to do with Jesus at all whatsoever. But even more, let's look at the Zerah. Okay? What does Zerah mean? The best example, I think, is let's look at Isaiah 53:10. Okay, 53:10.
All right.
Okay. In 53:10, it says that he shall see his seed. Mm-hmm. Now, understanding to be referring to Israel, of course, means a lot of descendants. Now, I've seen missionaries try and say, well, that means his spiritual seed. But they're not talking about one person. They're talking about a lot of them. Mm-hmm. Even if you want to use the interpretation, which is wrong, it's referring to spiritual seed or whatever kind of phony baloney, which we don't see in the Tanakh at all. Even if you want to say such a thing, it's not talking about one, it's talking about multiple. I don't remember a single instance in the Tanakh, there may be one, where Zerah is actually used in the singular, meaning one.
Yeah, and I think even till this day, like there are some words that might be in the singular, but we use them as plural.
Yeah, it's very common. Hebrew is not English, okay? So, like in English, there's words like sheep. Okay, sheep is one, and sheep is multiple. Okay, mm-hmm. That's pretty well known. Okay, so each language is different. Okay, it's very important. When you're trying to do exegesis, it's very important you understand the language you're working with. Looking in a Strong's concordance or something like that doesn't help you. Because Strong's will give 5 or 6 things and you won't know which one's going to apply because you don't know how to read the text and get the contextual truth, the contextual cues of what's going on, mm-hmm. the nuances from it. Okay, that's one of the things that makes it very difficult discussing some of these things with Christians who don't know the language because they don't get that. Okay, anything more to say on that? Yeah. So again, the 2 points about this with the Galatians gets wrong is number one is the blessings are for this worldly things, the land, descendant, stuff like that, which was not true with Jesus. And number two is he just there is multiple. And if we look at other places like Isaiah 53:10, where Zer is used there, nobody says it means just a single one. It doesn't even make sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you're taking the servant there as Jesus, what do you mean? What's the single seed? Who's he talking about? There's going to be another Messiah coming later on? We don't. Doesn't make sense. Okay. So again, this is basically Paul doing eisegesis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if you want to see a very good example of New Testament where it's eisegesis, Galatians here is a good example of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, a question, Rabbi, would Paul have been doing some sort of, I don't know, rabbinical practice contemporary to his day? Is this a Mishnah? Is this something else? Like what would be?
Okay, what you're trying to say is like this. Okay, so he's doing eisegesis,
Mm-hmm.
but is this like a valid type of thing? And the question is only if you've assumed your answer, then you're putting into a text. The Zera thing you can never, is just flat out wrong. Well, let's just say, he's playing with and doing something like that, whatever. Then the question is, well, your verse is still not teaching what you're saying.
Right.
Where do you get the principle that Abraham's blessing is for the Messiah? You don't have any proof for it.
Mm-hmm.
The verse you're using doesn't say it's eisegesis. But remember when I gave the example from the rabbis, the reason why I give the rabbis of Isaiah 53:10, because it's quite clear. What you're saying the verse is hinting at is true. When you get well, you start feeling better. And your desires come back. Well, it's not what the verse says, but okay, you can consider that a valid type of eisegesis. What your underlying thing is true. Okay. However, here the question will remain: where do you have it that Abraham's promise is fulfilled in the Messiah? That verse is not what it's saying from. So where is your underlying proof of it? Mm-hmm. Where do you get to them? Oh, because I believe that Jesus. Okay, well, you believe it means that your argument's circular. You have no support for it. Okay, that's what the problem is here. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's not that he's using a format that the rabbis do. The rabbis do it also. But when they're teaching, they have a true statement that they have support from, and then they use a verse for it. So the question comes again. You're trying to prove that Jesus is the fulfillment of Abraham. Well, where do you have proof of that? Mm-hmm. Show me your proof of that, and then I'll say, okay. I mean, it's not what the verse says, but okay, I understand it's an eisegesis, it's a measure, that's fine. But first, you have to be able to prove it, or it's just simply rejected. There's a famous rabbi, Nachmanides, who was one time, in a disputation. In Spain, they forced Jews to actually get into disputations about their faith. And somebody brought up a medrash of one sort. And he said, listen, a medrash is like a sermon. I could reject it. If it's not what the truth is, it's rejectable. Okay? And the same with that. It's rejectable. If it doesn't have, if what you're claiming isn't true, then, it's just not true. Okay? You can bring 1,000 verses. The verse is not, the truism is just being attached to the verse. Not the verse is true, is your proof of it. And that's what's going on there. In Hebrew, in the Talmud, we refer to something as an asmachta. Asmachta means like a leaning. You lean on it. Mm-hmm. Okay? You have a true statement, but you're just leaning on this verse as saying, the Torah hints at it also. You can find a hint of this in the Torah. Okay? It's a technique. There's certain theological things behind it. But again, underlining it is that what you're using the verse for has to be talking about something that's true. If it's not true, then it's just eisegesis. You're making it up. And right. That's the problem with Galatians 3. Mm-hmm. Where is your proof that Abraham's promise is fulfilled in the Messiah? Where does that come about? Where do you find that? Okay. I have
and not to mention that if that had been the original intent, right, that then the context that follows, namely the conquest and the apportioning of the land and the tribes and all that stuff, wouldn't make much sense, because then wasn't that all meant for the Messiah anyway? Why are we wasting our time with tribes and right?
Yeah. Well, let's say there happened to be a different verse that said Abraham's promise will be fulfilled in the Messianic times. Okay, there is no such verse, but let's say that. Then you might have some kind of a source for that. It's not the Messiah, it's a Messianic time, so it would still be incorrect, but at least you're getting close to something. You can say that it's a half-truth. Okay, but the problem is the underlying thing is you can't prove that.
Yeah.
And that's really the point that I'm trying to make, is there's a difference between eisegesis. I mean, I'm not opposed of people doing things with verses. I mean, I've done, had said biblical interpretations of verses, which isn't what the verse is talking about, but using the verse to bring out a moral lesson that we all know is true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, or something else that the rabbis teach. We do, there's whole books of these kinds of things. Rabbinic commentaries which follow this kind of thing. The reason why they're valid is because what we're attaching to the verse is true. The verse didn't mean it, but what we're attaching. And the problem with Galatians 3 is that it's just not there. It's just not there. Okay, there's nowhere that tells us that the Messiah is fulfilling the promise to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we know what Abraham was promised. He had a bunch of kids, and that he would be given the land of Israel. That was never, that has nothing to do with the Messiah. That all that stuff was, you could say even when the Exodus from Egypt, there were, 600,000 men, but probably 3 million people, and they went into the land. That's certainly a clear fulfillment of that. And as soon as they entered that in Joshua, the whole promises to Abraham would be given. The only part of the promise wasn't that we were told it would be forever. So he's told it was going to happen, but later it gets added that's going to be forever. It will never take away. We see many verses, even if they go into exile, they're going to come back again. Hashem says no, even though it's fulfilled here, it's an eternal promise. We're going to find other verses tell you that it's eternal. But again, there's just no place which supports what the truth of what Galatians is trying to say. There's no support for it. It's Paul's view. Paul says that this is what it is, and he's using it. Well, Paul is just Paul.
Right.
His view is as good as mine or yours. Okay.
And to me, for him to use the whole argument of the plural versus singular kind of thing just goes to show you that he doesn't really have any evidence. It sounds like a red herring almost. It's just
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to number 2.
Yeah, let's go to the next one. So the next one reads...
Mark, I was really hoping to get much more, but it looks like we'll have to...
Sounds good. I mean...
You'll have to have me back more often.
We want to do this justice, and, we are... I don't mind taking our time and everything, so... Yeah. All right, second reads, the Messiah would be a descendant of Isaac. And generally referencing Genesis 17, verse 19, and Jacob, and also a descendant of Jacob based on Numbers 24:17.
Okay, let's look into that one. Okay, this is actually 2. It should really have been split up into 2, but we'll take it as one. Let's look at 17. Let's look at the beginning. Okay, he pulls out 17:19, which is fine, but let's look at the beginning. Starts in chapter 17. Abram is his name before that. He's 90 years old. And God appears to him. And God says what? Verse 2. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. Multiply him. What does it mean multiply? He's not going to clone him.
Right.
It doesn't mean that God's going to clone Abraham. Multiply means he's going to have a lot of children. Mm-hmm. We saw that before, by the way. Mm-hmm. Invariably, always again, he's going to have a lot of children. Okay? A little bit of a problem for our friend Paul, but whatever. Mm-hmm. Okay? Well, Abraham falls in his place. And in verse 4, God continues what is. Abraham falls in face, and God says, I am going to make my covenant with you, and you shall be a father of a multitude of nations. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, what does that mean? Abraham is a father of the Arab nations, and a number of other nations are descended from him. There were many nations descended from Abraham. Okay? So God's promising here that he's going to be a father of many nations. He's going to be multiplied, have a lot of kids, and be a father of many nations. Okay? And then he said it's not called Avram, it's called Avruham, because Avruham means, father of many nations. So it says, let's go to 7. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee. Thy seed is referring to the multitude that's going to happen after throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed for after thee. So God is making a covenant that he'll have descendants, and God will always associate himself with those descendants. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land of thy sojournings, all of the land Canaan, for an everlasting possession. So what is the promises being given here? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The promises again. He's going to have many, many children. He's to be given the promise of the land. I don't see Messiah coming in here anywhere at all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now,
Yeah.
in fact, the interesting thing is this is the blessing. This is a blessing which is really to Abraham. Okay. There is a blessing to Isaac. There was a famine in chapter 26. Let me give you again, as I've said before, context is always very important. Okay. So that's why I always try and explain to what's going on before we start. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 26, there's a famine in the land of Canaan where Isaac was. And so Isaac wanted to go down to Egypt. God tells him not to. So he goes down to the land of the Philistines. Okay. And there he goes down, so not to go into Egypt. Okay. So he's told not to go down there. Now, when you're going into exile, looks like things aren't good. So verse 3 was said, sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and I will bless thee, for unto thee and unto thy seed I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore unto Abraham thy father. Okay, so the promise is passed down to Isaac. The promise is, and what? And 4, and I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven. Okay, so we see he's going to have a lot of seed, a lot of kids. And will give unto thy seed all these lands, and by the seed shall all the nations of earth bless themselves. People will bless themselves from that. They'll see, look how God has treated these people. They're such a blessing. Because that Abraham hearkened unto my voice and kept my charges, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Again, what do we see here? What do we see here? Very simple. The blessing has now been passed on to Isaac, but it's the same blessing. You're going to have multiple children. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
This really just kills Galatians. Okay? He's renewing that the covenant is going to be continued with Isaac. He's the one who's getting it. All the other children of Abraham are now locked out. It's Isaac who's going to get it, and he's going to have multiple children, a lot of them, and they're going to get the land. Again, a physical thing. Okay?
And the other thing too is flesh this one out for us. We read this that word often, the everlasting. It's an everlasting covenant. What do you think that meant?
Okay, that means non-revocable.
Non-revocable.
We're going to actually come up to this in with Jeremiah and Ezekiel. We're going to come up to that. Okay, when we see those. Some real legitimate, real Messianic prophets, we're going to see it again where God talks again how his promise, Ezekiel it is, how his promise is non-revocable. I know that bothers a lot of Christians, but God is quite clear about it. It's a non-revocable agreement. Okay. So that's Isaac. And again, Isaac again has a promise. It's nothing to do with the Messiah at all. Okay. Now we know the promise is handed down to Jacob also in other places, but let's just deal with the Numbers verse because the Numbers verse is very important. Numbers verse here is a little bit different from what we've been dealing with before because the Numbers verse has a little bit to say for itself.
Okay.
And so I want to discuss that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, Numbers 24, let's give a little bit of a introduction to what's going on. What's going on here is in this section, we have Bilam, who was a prophet, and there was a king of Moab, and was Balak. And he wanted that Bilam should curse the Jewish people. There's a whole story of cursing, whatever would happen to them. There's a few chapters. So finally, after all of this, we get to Numbers 24. And what happens is that God's been telling him things all along, okay? But then Bilam decides to stay on his own. So we have here in chapter 24, I'm going to read from verse 17, okay? There's a little bit more than that. But I will read from verse 17, and then we can get to 19. It says 70, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not nigh. Meaning that he's looking to the future and he sees something that's going to happen, but he doesn't see it near. There shall come forth a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Scepter refers to somebody's going to be a king who's a descendant of Jacob, and shall smite through the corners of Moab, and break down all the sons of Seth, and Edom shall be a possession. Seir also, even his enemies, shall be a possession. And out of Jacob shall one have dominion, and shall destroy the remnant of the city. And he looked on Amalek, after talking about those, looked at Amalek, and took up his parable, and said, Amalek was the first of nations, but his end shall come to destruction. Okay, so what do we see here? We see that somebody descended from Jacob, who's going to have a scepter, who's going to be a king, is going to destroy, he's going to be a warrior and destroy all these nations. Okay, now there's two possibilities of understanding this. I'm going to do the first one, which is from Rashi, and then we'll do another one. In fairness, we're going to, give the multiple ones. And Rashi understands this referring to King David. Where does he get it that it confers to King David? He points to the second book of Samuel, chapter 8, where David has wars. And one of the wars he has, we see in verse 2, and he smote Moab, meaning he destroyed Moab. And we see various next couple of verses, he says other places where he destroyed. And then we get down to verse 13, and it talks about David got him a name, and he returned smiting the Arameans. Okay, and 14, he puts garrisons in Edom. So we see that King David, similarly to what in 24, he's a descendant of Jacob, and he has a scepter, he's a king, and he destroys the nations that it says in chapter 24 he's going to do. Rashi says that's what it means. However, there is another interpretation. So let's be fair and do the other interpretation, because this is the one that Christians are trying to say is a messianic type of interpretation.
And just to be clear, it really does look like that should be the right interpretation if you read the latter part of that verse on 17, where it says
invariably the commentary Rashi, what he's trying to do, not 100% of the time, but certainly most of the time, he's trying to give you the simple meaning of the text, within its context, what seems to be what it's talking about the best. Okay, so we do see it lines up with David. However, there is an interpretation that exists. It's not certain if it's literal or not, where it says that the star coming from Jacob is referring to the Messiah. Now, we know this because in the 2nd century, there was a revolt of the Jewish people against Hadrian when he tried to restrict them from being able to keep the Jewish laws, like the circumcision, Shabbos, and things like that. They revolted against him. The leader's name was Bar Kokhba. He became actually a king for about 3 years. The war lasted about 3 years, and he was a king for a time. He changed his name to Bar Kokhba, the son of a star, because of this verse here. Okay? So there is a homiletic way of understanding it to be that, messianic. So I don't think it's a simple meaning. There are messianic, so we can't say it's not. However, if you read it, I don't see how, even if you say it's messianic, what's that have to do with Jesus? Jesus was not a warrior like King David. He did not, fight wars with Moab and all these different places, whatever. He didn't do that. He was not the warrior defeating Edom. Okay, he didn't do that. So how could you say he fulfilled it? So even if you want to say Numbers 24 is messianic, which there is support, again, there's Jewish support for that, okay? Whether you consider it weak or strong is really not the point, but there is Jewish support for that. I have to admit the truth. However, Jesus did nothing in it. Even if you say he's going to come back and do it, you've read Left Behind, I'm sure. We could talk about that sometime. But I mean, I read the whole thing where you have all these wars and stuff like that going on. But bottom line, he never did it. So it's just something that, even if it is, it's not on the list of things he did. So it doesn't belong in the list of things, prophecies about Jesus, because he didn't do it. Okay? So even if you want to take that view, which again, I didn't find any commentary that says that, a Jewish commentary that says that's the one, but I do know that it has been used in Medrash and stuff like that, referring to Messiah. And of course, we know historically, Bar Kokhba took the name because of that. It has nothing to do with Jesus.
All right. Shall we move on to the next one?
Let's do number 3.
Okay. So the third one is the Messiah would be from the tribe of Judah, and they're looking at Genesis 49:10. And here's that word again, scepter.
Again. Yeah, scepter is a sign of ruler.
Ruler, right?
Okay, there's no question about it. Again, now the context of this is before Jacob dies, and this is something that is customarily people try and do it. He brought all his children in front of him, and he blessed each and every one of them. He gave him, a different kind of blessing that he felt was appropriate for each and every one of them. Okay, so in this case, we're dealing with 49:10 is dealing with the blessing that was for Judah. Okay, now the blessing actually starts in verse 8. Okay? Okay. It says, Judah, thee shall thy brethren praise, thy hand shall be on the back of thine enemies, thy father's sons shall bow down before Judah was known. When they had the wars in for conquering the land, Judah, the tribe of Judah was very important to that. Okay? Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who shall rouse up? Okay. Now, this clearly seems to be indicating what's happening when they're going to conquer the land. The tribe of Judah is again, leading in many wars. But here it comes to something else, which the Christians interpret one day. There's other interpretations. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler stand from between his feet, as long as men come to Shiloh. That's the way the JPS translates it. The King James translates it, I think, a little bit better in this case. What the King James says is that scepter by from Judah, nor the lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. Now, what is Shiloh? Is of course the question. And unto him shall the obedience of the people be. Okay, tells a little bit more blessings for him. What's going to happen? Shiloh was a city in the desert. They made the tabernacle. Okay. They didn't have a temple, so they worshipped in the tabernacle. Now, when they conquered the land, the tabernacle was brought to Shiloh. It was a central part. Okay. Now, Shiloh was eventually destroyed. It was still an important place. And after the destruction, the kingship eventually ended from Saul, who was a tribe of Benjamin, and came to the tribe of Judah. Now, the simple meaning by many commentaries, and I think this is really what the actual meaning is that until the Jewish people go to Shiloh, meaning they come, Shiloh ends, and the actual founding, the actual bringing together of the kingdom, the anointing of David that happened there. Until that time happens, then when that time happens, then the scepter will go to Judah, and that he will be the one who has the right to be king. Okay, that's the simple understanding from there, what I believe. However, let's ignore that a second. Let's go and say, okay, let's say it refers to Messianic. Okay, so how is this understood to be Messianic? And then let's see if it can apply. Okay, the Messianic understanding is that the scepter shall not depart from Judah means when the Messiah comes, he will be the king, the last come. And then there'll be nobody else besides him. Okay, so essentially it ends there. Now, with that, there's a few problems. As I pointed out first, Shiloh, the word Shiloh is ambiguous. It could be for the different. But if we say it refers to the Messiah, it's not referring to Jesus. Why? Well, the simplest, of course, is this. What does the scepter refer to? Does the scepter refer to kingship, or does the scepter refer to rulership? It could be a governor or somebody who had the power to rule. Okay. In either case, Jesus had neither of them. Again, Jesus had neither of them. As far as kingship, the kingship stopped in Babylonia. There is one exception. Bar Kokhba was king for 3 years. So even after Jesus, there was somebody who was a king, a Jewish king. So that doesn't work very well. But more importantly, let's take the scepters meaning rulership. Okay, you're a ruler. Okay. I want to look at a passage in Jeremiah 52, something that people don't know about. Okay. Now, as we know, the Jewish people went into exile in Babylonia. Jeremiah talks about it. Okay, we see it at the end of the Book of Kings. We see it in the Book of Chronicles. And Jeremiah talks about it also, how the Jewish people went into exile. They went to Babylonia. When they went there, the kings that existed were deposed. No more kings. Okay? And from then on, the Davidic kingship basically died. However, if we understand scepter to mean rulership, that they were like ruling over the Jewish people, let's look at Jeremiah 52:31. Okay? I'm going to read a little bit long passage, but just to understand what's going on here. And it came to pass in the 730th year of the captivity of Joachim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, 5 and 20th day of the month, that Evil Marduk, king of Babylonia, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Joachim, king of Judah, and brought him forth out of prison. Now, he was exiled, blinded, and thrown into prison. However, what happened was, the king of Babylonia took him out of prison, okay, and raised him up. 32. And he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylonia. Meaning that in Babylonia, there were kings, but there were captive kings under the king of Babylonia. Okay? And these people were still, in a sense, kings, rulers, okay? 33, and he changed his prison garment and did eat bread before him and continued all the days of his life. And for his allowance, there was a continual allowance given him of the king of Babylonia every day, portion until the end of his death, all of his days. So we see that while the ruling family wasn't wiped out, when the Persians took over, this position he had became permanent. Okay? There was, from that time on, among the Jews who lived in Babylonia, what they called the head of the exile. He was a descendant of King David through this line, this person's, Joachim's children, grandchildren, okay, he wasn't a real king, but he was like a sub-king. Persians, they may have actually called him king, but that's not what we called. We didn't refer him to a king, we called the head of the exile, okay? He ruled in the exile under the Persians. He had authority there. It wasn't a very uncommon thing, like almost like a client kingdom. He ruled the Jewish people. Now, the problem for the Jesus interpretation is that post existed until the 11th century. It existed under the Persians. When the Arabs came in, it existed under the Arabs. It finally ended when the Seljuk Turks conquered the area from the Arabs. Then it ended in the 11th century. The 11th century actually saw a very big turnover socially among the Jewish people at that time. It was a very big time, but the 11th century, that's when it changed. So the problem here is, if you refer the scepter to kingship, either it ended in Babylonia, or possibly it actually existed after Jesus under Bar Kokhba, if you want to consider that, or if you consider just rulership, actual rulership, continuing from the Davidic line of rulership, that continued until the 11th century when the Seljuk Turks ended it. In no case is this anything to do with the Messiah or Mashiach or anything, Messiah or Jesus or anything like that. Nothing. It's just historically inaccurate. Okay. Now, of course, we do know that the Messiah is going to come from Judah, but that's not from here. Okay. So again, this is not messianic.
So they're connecting dots that shouldn't be connected, is what it looks like.
They're connecting dots. No, they're only connecting the dots that they want to see.
That they want to see.
A whole bunch of dots going on beyond that they're not looking at.
Right.
Okay. They're ignoring what it is because, again, they're trying to make it say what they want it to, and it doesn't say that.
Yeah, nor did Jesus function in any way, shape, or form as a ruler or a king or anything.
He wasn't a ruler, he wasn't a king, and they claim it'll happen in the future. Well, and it happened I'm going to win the lottery in the next lottery in 3 months, okay? I'm going to win the lottery then. So you should lend me a lot of money because I'm going to be able to pay you back when I win the lottery. Nobody in the world would ever do that. That's not the way it works. Hashem promises are literally done, and that's the way it is. Okay.
Well, there you have it, folks. So that's where we're going to go ahead and hit the brakes on this one. And even though it was only 3, I think we did cover a lot of great and useful information. So this is great.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun to do these things. I try to put out information that's not there in a way that's not there. I think it's important. People have different approaches, whatever, but I don't want it to be simple. I want it to be people who are going to think. Because when you think about it, you realize what the truth is and what's not.
All righty. Well, thank you, Rabbi. Next time, we should pick up on the Messiah would be from the line of David. Then the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. That's one we hear a lot, especially during the Christmas holiday for Christians. And then the Messiah would be born of a virgin, which gets into Isaiah. So a lot of good stuff to come, folks.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night, Rabbi. And then I do want to encourage you folks to check out the info on YouTube, where you're going to find links. I'm going to post links there for Rabbi Shulman so that you can check out his work and follow him and everything. And so thank you, folks. Until next time, this has been Apostate of Mind.